Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam, and today I have what I consider to be a really special video planned. As it seems to happen as the year starts to come to an end, I somehow start to circle back to the topic of narcissism, and I've been looking at what's going on in the YouTube sphere out there. I see people getting progressively a bit smarter about how they talk about it, and I've been also, as I mentioned before, looking into the whole topic about Stanislav Grof and perinatal psychology and birth trauma. And I've been doing that through a book that is called Psychology of the Future. I'm about halfway through, but I already found a connection between becoming or rather healing from narcissistic abuse and perinatal trauma, or trauma that happens while in the womb or during the birth process. I believe that this link between those two topics explains why we are ultimately exposed to narcissistic abuse, how that happens, and why it is so incredibly and almost impossibly difficult to become fully cured of it without going through a complete psycho-spiritual awakening. I don't believe it's possible to do so without such a process. And in today's video, I want to explain why that is the case, why I believe that is the case. I've not heard this mentioned anywhere else. That doesn't mean that it is new. It's just a discovery for myself. Then again, I do follow supposed experts on the topic like Sam Wagner and Richard Grannon, and I've not heard them mention this stuff. So here it is for whatever it's worth. And it might be a longer video than normal this time around, but I'm hoping to do the video justice. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to read a few passages from the book, whilst being fully aware that that is not going to do justice to the book as a proper review, and I might do that somewhere in the future, but I think it's important to give you that context. I'm going to start with the punchline, actually, and then build a case towards it if that connection is not immediately made. Now, in this passage, Grof is talking about certain deviations of the mind that have to do with sexual behavior. And in this case, he's talking about rapists, actually. A pretty heavy topic, right? But he mentioned something that struck a chord immediately, and I made the analogy between physical rape versus mental or soul level rape, which is in essence what narcissistic abuse can be called. And it goes like this. So the passage says, because of this similarity between the experience of rape and the birth experience, we'll talk about that later, the rape victim suffers a psychological trauma that reflects not only the painful impact of the recent situation, but also, and here it comes, the breakdown of the defenses protecting her or him against the memory of biological birth. We'll see why this is so important. The breakdown of the defenses protecting him or her against the memory of biological birth. The frequent long-term emotional problems following rapes are very probably caused by the emergence into consciousness of perinatal emotions and psychosomatic manifestations. Therapeutic resolution will have to include work on the trauma of birth. That is the essence of what I want to propose about soul rape or narcissistic abuse, in which we are not subjected to physical abuse of this kind unless we're talking about someone who's also psychopathic, but in which our being has been manipulated with someone's dirty intentions and dirty hands. And how what I'm proposing, or the link that I'm proposing, is that in being narcissistically abused, all the psychosomatic defenses that we had built against birth trauma are annihilated. And everything just comes to the foreground. And that's why we are so dramatically deregulated when we go through something like this. And so now I want to read some of the quotes that Groff states about birth trauma, because they are important for us to understand why this is so important. See, in this channel, I had been making a whole case about developmental trauma, or trauma that is natural to a human existence. And most of my focus had gone into trauma in very early childhood, right after birth, right? Maternal neglect, or variability in the environment, objectification, parentification, the kind of things that make us feel unsafe as an infant, and which elicit the growth of an ego that is meant to try and cater to an environment so that one can stay safe. But before that comes the birth of trauma, which Groff is very much focused on in this book. And I want to read some of those passages and make a link towards why this is so important when it comes to recovering from narcissistic abuse, or even perhaps narcissism as such. But so here it goes, right? So here's the general take of Groff about birth and the birth trauma. He says, the amount of emotional and physical stress involved in childbirth clearly surpasses that of any postnatal trauma in infancy and childhood discussed in psychodynamic literature, with the possible exception of extreme forms of physical abuse. Of course, he didn't consider narcissistic abuse in this statement, but let's take it for what it's worth. He says, biological birth is the most profound trauma of our life, and an event of paramount psycho-spiritual importance. It is recorded in our memory in minuscule detail, down to the cellular level, and it has a profound effect on our psychological development. He also says, and this is an interesting statement, birth is a potential or actual life-threatening event. So we tend to think of birth as the moment where our life begins, but of course we were a fetus already before that. And the actual birth moment is life-threatening as an event. The delivery brutally terminates the intrauterine existence of the fetus. He or she, in between quotes, he says, dies as an aquatic organism and is born as an air-breathing, physiologically and even anatomically different form of life. So he's making here a huge emphasis on just how cataclysmic an event birth is for a life that had lived in the uterus until then. It's an absolute cataclysmic event. He also goes on to say these experiences leave deep unconscious imprints in the psyche that later in life have an important influence in the life of the individual. And he refers to these dynamic constellations in the deep unconscious as basic perinatal matrices. So they are not just something, but they are bundles of or constellations in the deep unconscious that influence the very way in which we try to survive daily life and enact our those imbalances towards the world. I couldn't quite find the passage in the book, but he also explains something that is directly related to narcissism and these kind of things, and where this trauma of birth is stored. See, during birth, or rather, part of the reason that traditional psychology didn't take birth trauma so seriously until now, is that they were arguing that when we are born, they probably dissected fetuses that died during birth or whatever. They checked out their brain, and they said, the prefrontal cortex and every part of the brain that has to do with our human existence is still not myelinated. Myelin is a kind of coating that protects our brain cells, our neurons. And without myelin, there's no neuronal activity. And so we are kind of brain dead when we are born, to the degree, at least in our prefrontal cortex. So the cortex doesn't register birth, and it doesn't register birth trauma. But the mistake that psychology makes is that the fact that the prefrontal cortex is not myelinated means that the birth trauma is not registered anywhere. And I would theorize, although I didn't read it here, but it's kind of implied, that there are parts of our nervous system that in fact are myelinated and do record the birth trauma. And that has to do with the deep unconscious near the very parts of our neurology that register our deeper survival instincts near the throat, the heart, and the solar plexus, which is exactly what keeps firing up during psychological abuse and during moments of distress or panic attacks and things of that kind. That circuitry doesn't need the prefrontal cortex to understand that you're in danger and to become incredibly unpleasant when you're in danger. It doesn't listen to the prefrontal cortex when you're in danger, nor can you use psychology or thinking to manipulate what that part of your neurology does. That's why psycho-spiritual technologies are required to tap into and heal those parts of yourself. It's because the thinking mind can't get there. We're dealing with different circuitry, which is much more ancient, more primitive, but also more primeval in the sense that it is circuitry that was already there and took the imprint of the trauma birth when we were born. I think this is fascinating stuff, by the way. If you can feel that in the tone of voice, I'm really nerding out here right in front of everybody. I think that is the main gist of what I wanted to read about Groff. But there is another element here as well that I wanted to read, which goes to why it's difficult then to deal with healing narcissistic abuse. And it says this. He says, the reason why this effort, he's talking about some sort of healing effort in which people go into, compulsive behavior or whatever, is unsuccessful and does not result in self-healing is the fact that it does not reach deep enough into the unconscious and lacks the element of introspection, insight, and understanding the nature of the process. So I think that is enough when it comes to quoting Groff. And if I had to then make a kind of logical a case for everything that I just explained here is as follows. We suffer a certain type of trauma during birth. It's stored in perinatal areas of our nervous system, which form before the personal parts of our nervous system are even there. In other words, we become traumatized before we are a person, before we are a psychological person. And that trauma is stored there, and it is such a cataclysmic event that an entire host of defenses and dams is built to keep that trauma repressed. For most people, that repression lasts for life. And it is precisely the process of psychodynamic alchemy or meditation, body work, working with rebirth techniques or psychedelics that has the capacity to reopen that, but it has to be reopened in a skillful kind of way. Some traumas also open it. Narcissistic abuse is one such trauma, but that is an uncontrolled opening of those dams that were created to keep the perinatal trauma repressed. Now, because that perinatal trauma is not healed, it gives narcissists a kind of leverage. Because that trauma not being healed, it is unknown to us, and therefore it can be tapped into, and we can be manipulated from there without anything that our logical mind can do about it. In fact, to our logical mind, the entire thing acquires not just an emotional flavor, but a kind of ominous, eschatological, end of days, spiritual, archetypal level that we can't even understand or grasp. It's beyond us, in a sense, because it is beyond the purview of the thinking and emotional circuitry of the mind. It resides somewhere else that is way, way deeper in our neurology, way deeper in our neurology, deeper than our personality goes, deeper than our logical, social, and emotional self can reach. That's why it feels unknown and completely strange, and it feels like it has power over us, because it actually does have power over us. Now, once that trauma is there and we don't heal it, we of course go enacting that trauma everywhere we go, until we go through the entire process of going to the deepest recesses of our subconscious and bringing all that out, which is, as I said, an exceptionally difficult, lengthy, and painful process. And I have emphasized this time and again for a very long time, right? Now, here's the kicker: is anything more superficial than that is not going to heal that perinatal trauma. And it just so happens to be that narcissistic abuse taps precisely into that depth of our unconscious. It is tapping into our very survival mechanisms and the seeking for pleasure and avoiding pain, and it creates a kind of disjunction between those two that taps directly into that circuitry. I'm speculating now, but I believe that this is the case. And once this is, and it does so, by forcefully entraining us to open our subconscious and remove the dams that had held that trauma at bay. So once that trauma is completely exposed, the narcissist presents his or herself as the one that can keep that at bay, and we become completely dependent on that person for our very survival, actually, for our very peace of mind and our very stability, the very stability of our being. So we empty ourselves out and all this trauma becomes exposed. Once this has happened, we have no choice but to go all the way to tapping into and healing our perinatal trauma, because the very barriers that had kept it repressed have now been eroded through the process of narcissistic abuse. Hence my proposing that the only way to really fully heal for narcissistic abuse is to go all the way and heal the perinatal trauma, which means essentially embarking on a full psychosomatic and psycho-spiritual journey and becoming awakened. It's the equivalent to that. Not everybody makes that equivalence. I've done a review on the book The Pearl Beyond Price by A.H. Almaz. And if you read Almaz and if you read Groff, you start to come to the conclusion that it is perinatal trauma and the deepest recesses of the subconscious that need to be cleared out for us to live a fully awakened and rewarding life. Because so long as that is not the case, then these things will only be repressed or suppressed. Narcissistic trauma is an involuntary and aggressive, in fact, recalcitrant and potentially life-threatening or life-destroying way to remove the barriers that had kept our deepest subconscious trauma from reaching our conscious mind. Normally, the process is much more progressive, and you would learn to ground your body, you would learn to balance your state of mind, you would titrate, or in other words, go through an acclimatization process with the energetic and somatic and psychological implications of tapping into the deep subconscious, so that you can follow a certain process of doing this. If you mess around with a narcissist, your deep subconscious is just going to start hitting you right in the face, and the archetypal strangeness and power of the experience is going to be largely unmanageable for you. It's just the nature of that space of the mind, actually. That is not to say that nothing can be done. It just means that ideally you would not be in the back foot of your mental and emotional regulation by the time you tackle the psycho-spiritual development process. But if you are, you should know that this process is going to be extraordinarily difficult and lengthy and painful, right? Like, there's going to be no other way around this. And I think that Gran and Wagner would agree with me in that statement. So that means that tough days would be ahead, and I've experienced that myself, having been in such an encounter with one of these individuals. When I had already learned about meditation and had done some of that work, but nowhere near deeply enough, and now after that, forced to go into the very deep end of the subconscious and somehow start to learn to deal with these archetypal and perinatal forces that had been suddenly awakened, and which I could hardly do anything about with my logical conscious mind, or with willpower or discipline, God forbid. I mean, those tools are absolutely inadequate at the task of healing yourself of something that has exposed what otherwise remains forever repressed in your subconscious. Speaking of having the perinatal trauma be forever repressed, you could make a bit of a philosophical or let's say religious point about whether, in the larger scheme of things, if the universe wants to awake, it will use whatever means possible, including severe psychological narcissistic trauma, so that you are forced to visit the perinatal elements of your psyche. For other people, it doesn't have to be narcissistic abuse. Sometimes you simply undergo the death of a child or a divorce or something that will expose this trauma and make it so that you have to go all the way and heal your perinatal matrix and bring it to a proper level. So sometimes we get the choice to awaken, and sometimes we simply have to embark in that journey, because things that would have otherwise remained repressed have now surfaced one way or another, and we are forced to embark in a process and to somehow learn how to navigate with these forces, learn about the technologies that can help us self-regulate, that can help us go deeper into our own subconscious, and essentially clear it all out. There's no other, just nothing else that you can do. You are left without such a choice. You've been poked in just the right way, so that the very core of your being now needs to be resolved. There is something to be said about the barriers of the dam, or the dams that keep all these things at bay. These are psychological defenses, right? These are psychosomatic defenses that have kept all that trauma at bay, and for most people keep it at bay in a semi-successful or sometimes very successful way, and sometimes not such a successful kind of way. There is also something to be said about the fact that unless we tackle the perinatal matrix and resolve it for ourselves, we are always codependent on things in our surroundings to keep our integrity. In other words, very successful, healthy people will have an environment that keeps them very successful and healthy. They'll have the money, they'll have the social acquaintances and the social circle, and it's all very tightly knit. But the question is, if you remove 2 or 3 of those elements, would that person still be as put together as they are, or are they very porous? I was listening to Grannon say very often people who have done very well until then become exposed to narcissistic abuse when something hard hits in their life. That was the case with me. It was a big breakup. Because the tragedy is not that the tragedy, or let's put it this way, the tragedy makes you vulnerable not because the tragedy in and of itself makes you weak, but because the tragedy exposes the weakness in your perinatal subconscious. It exposes the weakness, and that exposure of the weakness is precisely what the narcissist would then tap into. So that's also something, and I believe it's food for thought. How many crutches we are using in terms of social status or social connections, emotional connections, financial stability, physical well-being. You name it. Anything can be used as a crutch to hide the fact that our perinatal trauma has not been resolved, and therefore we are terribly exposed. We are absolutely exposed, not just to narcissistic abuse, but to just imploding when things go wrong, which is, of course, part of the whole gist of what you could call the impetus for self-cultivation. So as you can tell, I'm very excited about this little discovery of mine this week. I think it brings a lot of these strands together in terms of why the perinatal trauma that Stanislav Grof goes on about is a very relevant topic. It explains why it is a trauma that is so difficult to tap into. And to me, it also explains why, so long as that is not healed, we are very much, or can potentially become extremely exposed to narcissistic abuse. And also explains why it is extremely difficult to heal narcissistic abuse, lest we go all the way into healing our perinatal matrices, which is equivalent to following the self-cultivation and self-realization, awakening and enlightenment path. So I'm very curious to hear what you guys make of this one. And as always, if you think that these are topics that other people might benefit from, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing is very motivating to me, and also makes the channel more visible out there. So thanks for listening thus far, and I hope to be back with videos pretty soon. Cheerio and bye-bye.